It started on a quiet morning, the kind that gives no hint of the storm that's coming. A man stood alone, his hands roughened by time and labor, holding a hammer that echoed with every strike against the wood. He wasn't building a house or a barn, at least not one that made sense to anyone watching. What he built was enormous, absurd even, stretching across the land like a monument to something no one believed in. Every day people passed by with furrowed brows, scoffing, whispering and laughing out loud. "This man has lost his mind," they said, but he kept working, sweat running down his temples, driven not by human reason, but by a voice no one else had heard. And that voice, the voice of God, had told him something terrifying. They mocked him relentlessly, throwing stones not just at the structure, but at his soul. Children mimicked him. Women turned their faces in pity, and the elders shook their heads with disdain. No flood had ever touched that region. Rain was a stranger to the land, a myth to many. Yet here was this man, cutting, measuring, and lifting, as if he saw something coming from beyond the clouds. He warned them. Again and again he warned them. But the more he pleaded, the louder their laughter grew. They called it a waste of time, of money, of strength. Some even accused him of seeking luxury and attention, but he didn't care for riches or fame. What he sought was obedience. What he felt was love, not just for his family, but for the very people who despised him. His message was not popular. It wasn't comfortable. It disrupted their routines, their parties, their plans. Who wants to hear about destruction when they're planning weddings, building businesses, and chasing comfort? Who wants to think about judgment when luxury is within reach? But still he spoke, not with anger or pride, but with sorrow and urgency, because he knew what was coming. And deep down, even as they laughed, some began to wonder, what if he was right? What if all their mockery couldn't stop what was already on its way? Tell me in the comments. If you had been there, would you have listened or laughed with the crowd? There was something sacred about his routine. Each nail driven into wood was like a prayer. Each board lifted into place was an act of faith. His hands ached, his back burned, but he pressed on. He was building in silence what they would only understand in chaos. The animals began to come, quietly and without force, 2 by 2, as if nature itself understood what humans refused to see. Some of the people stopped laughing then. They stared, they asked questions, but it was too late to fake faith. True belief doesn't bloom in fear. It takes root in obedience. And this man had obeyed long before there were any signs to validate him. And still, the sky was clear. The sun blazed in the heavens as if to mock him too. Days passed, then weeks, then years. He kept building, preparing, praying. 100 years of ridicule, a century of holding on to a word from God that seemed impossible. Who could endure that? Who could believe for that long? His name wasn't famous. He didn't wear fine robes or sit among rulers. But what he carried, that invisible promise, was more valuable than money, more powerful than luxury, more lasting than laughter. What the world saw as madness was actually mercy. And the longer he built, the closer something unseen began to move. The skies still hadn't changed, and for many that was all the evidence they needed. If there was to be a flood, wouldn't the clouds at least start to gather? Wouldn't the winds shift? But the sun kept shining, the earth remained dry, and the man's warnings faded again into background noise. He continued the work, day after day, not for applause, but out of obedience. His voice grew hoarse, but he did not stop speaking. His hands bled, but he did not stop building. Most had already returned to their lives, convinced nothing would ever happen. But a few still watched from a distance, not yet convinced, not yet laughing. If you're among those who still believe in something greater than what the eyes can see, take this moment to subscribe, because faith always sees what the world misses. Behind the curtain of normal life, something was already changing. The earth itself began to groan. There was a stillness that felt unfamiliar, like the calm before a battle. No one could name it, but some began to feel it. And in the midst of that subtle tension, the man stood taller. He was no longer just a builder of wood and nails. He had become a builder of trust, a living testimony that God still speaks and that his word never returns empty. The animals kept arriving, quiet, orderly, as if summoned by something greater than instinct. The people noticed. Whispers grew louder. Doubt crept in, not in the builder but in themselves. Was their wealth really enough to shield them? Could their money buy them time? Could their luxury keep them safe from what they had refused to believe? One by one, the doors of comfort began to close. Crops grew strangely, animals behaved oddly. Some wells began to dry, and sudden winds tore through places once untouched by storm. Yet still many refused to make the connection. They called it nature, coincidence, an unlucky season, anything but judgment, anything but divine. Because to admit the truth would mean admitting guilt, and guilt requires change. But change is inconvenient. Still, he continued, with each beam placed, he wasn't just building an ark, he was preparing a lifeline for those willing to see, for those willing to trust, for those who would choose faith over fear. The day arrived. The structure stood complete. Massive, mysterious, magnificent. Not a castle for kings, but a vessel of salvation, carved from obedience, shaped by sacrifice, held together not just by wood, but by love. It stood like a question posed to the entire world. Would you rather laugh in comfort or live through surrender? The man walked slowly to the massive door. He waited. No one followed. He waited longer. Still, no one came. Some stood far off, watching. Others turned their backs. And then, without a single human hand touching it, the door began to close. Heavy, final. A sound like thunder rolled across the ground, and it was too late. Inside, he wept. Not for himself, but for the souls outside. He remembered their faces, their laughter, their rejection. He had hoped they'd come. He had begged them to listen, but they had chosen another path. And now, only silence remained. Outside, the skies darkened for the first time in generations. Clouds gathered with unnatural speed. Winds howled with a voice no man had ever heard. And the first drops began to fall, not tears from man, but from heaven itself. And in that moment, the world remembered, too late, the man they mocked. The warning they ignored, the God they rejected. The rain didn't come as a drizzle, it struck like a war cry. Heaven opened, and what had once been mockery turned instantly into terror. Men who had laughed now screamed. Women who had dismissed the warnings clutched their children with trembling hands. The sky, once clear and predictable, now poured judgment without pause. Rivers swelled, the ground cracked, houses crumbled. And yet inside the massive vessel, the ark they had ridiculed, there was peace. The man sat silently with his family and the animals, not in triumph, but in mourning. He had not built it to prove anything to the world. He had built it because God had said to. And now every drop that fell confirmed the weight of that obedience. If this story has moved you, if your heart feels stirred by something greater, take a moment to like this video. Let others find this message too before it's too late. Panic spread like fire. People ran to the ark's sealed door, beating on it, crying out, pleading for entry. But it would not open. Not because the man refused them, but because it was no longer in his hands. God had closed it. And when God shuts a door, no strength, no riches, no amount of luxury or power can force it open. They offered everything. Money, possessions, promises. They screamed that they believed now. But faith born of fear is not faith. It is desperation. And desperation cannot undo decades of rejection. It cannot replace the quiet obedience that builds in silence, year after year, for a future no one else can see. The water rose quickly. Hills became islands, then vanished. The tallest buildings disappeared beneath the flood. What once gave status and pride now drowned in the same waters as everything else. And yet, the ark floated. Not because it was invincible, but because it had been built according to the word of God. That word, so often ignored, had become the very thing that held them above the storm. Inside, the man prayed, not for revenge, but for mercy. He didn't find joy in their downfall. He found sorrow, because love does not celebrate when the foolish fall. Love weeps. And in that sacred vessel, love endured, even as the world around it perished. Days turned into weeks. The waters covered everything. There was no more laughter, no more parties, no more business, no more luxury, only silence. And the ark, drifting through judgment, carried not just people and animals, but the last breath of hope for humanity. The man had once been a stranger to most. Now, his name would be remembered for generations, not because he was perfect, but because he believed, because he obeyed, because when God spoke, he listened, even when no one else did. And that obedience didn't just save him, it preserved a future, a new beginning, a promise beyond the storm. When the waters finally began to recede, the sky broke open with light. The same hands that had sent the flood were now extending grace. And as the ark came to rest on solid ground, the man stepped out into a world washed clean, a world ready for a new chapter. But the story is not about the ark. It's not even about the flood. It's about the decision, the choice to trust God when it costs everything, to believe before the evidence appears, to prepare while others laugh. And today, that decision still stands before us, before you. If this message stirred something deep within you, don't walk away unchanged. Subscribe, share this with someone you care about, and stay with us for the next powerful message waiting for you on the screen. Because what you choose now changes everything.